To look more deeply into the story about Bolivia, we're going to be joined now by Ben Norton in New York. He's a journalist. He writes with Gray Zone, and we want to welcome Ben Norton to the show. First time on CN Live. Thanks for coming on, Ben.
Thanks for having me.
So Ben Norton and Max Blumenthal wrote an extraordinary piece within about 2 days of the departure from office of Evo Morales in Bolivia. He was forced out by the military, and he's now in Mexico. But they came up with an unbelievable story, great research, brilliantly written, and we republished it on Consortium News. We're very happy to do that, and it revealed so much that I had no idea about. Many people probably did not know about Bolivia, and particularly all of these extreme right-wing fascist type groups, and especially this guy, Mr. Camacho, Feliz. What is his name? Sorry, Feliz.
Yeah, Luis Fernando Camacho.
Luis Fernando. Camacho. Yeah, Luis Fernando Camacho, who in your article makes clear that he wasn't all that well known before either. He didn't get a lot of Twitter followers, and nobody knew who this guy was. He's a multimillionaire. His family were corporate elites, and they part of their land, I think, where it was taken by was nationalized by Morales. And suddenly, out of nowhere, he became the leader. And Reuters and the New York Times started to refer to him as a leader. A guy who was virtually unknown, overnight became the leader of the opposition. Tell us how that happened, Ben.
Well, it happened much in the same way that the same kind of phenomenon, the same coup strategy unfolded in Venezuela. Of course, the coup did not work in Venezuela for a variety of reasons we can talk about. But on January 23rd in Venezuela, a young 31-year-old politician whom 87% of Venezuelans had never heard of, according to a poll, named Juan Guaidó, declared himself interim president. And of course, the US government had handpicked him to be the so-called opposition leader. And suddenly this man who the vast majority of people had never heard of claimed to be the president of a country that happened to have the largest oil reserves in the world, and was recognized overnight by the US and European allies and right-wing governments in Latin America. That was all we now know, a concerted strategy that was planned for months in advance with the leadership of the US, with support from Colombia, Brazil, right-wing oligarchs in European countries, and Canada. Let's not leave out Canada. And similarly, this coup in Bolivia, we're beginning to see, as we pull at the strings, we're beginning to see who exactly has been behind it. But it's clear that Washington, of course, played a leading role in it, along, once again, with some of the same players, Canada, European countries, and then regionally, Colombia and Brazil. And you mentioned Camacho, and I'm glad you stressed that he was little known before this coup. And we see the way in which corporate media outlets play, kind of as handmaidens or stenographers to the US government and its allies in pushing these coups. The New York Times and Reuters, as I mentioned in my article, immediately began referring to him as an opposition leader, referring to him as if he were an elected official or something in Bolivia. This is a man, Luis Fernando Camacho, who has never won a democratic election. He has never been elected for a public office. The only claim to fame he has is that he was born into a very wealthy family. Specifically, his elite family controlled gas companies. Bolivia has major natural gas reserves, and when really up until 2006, when Evo Morales was first democratically elected, up until that point, these gas reserves were not used to benefit the majority of the Bolivian population, who lived in poverty, 2/3 of the country nearly being indigenous. Instead, the natural gas was exported to multinational companies, to the US, to European nations, and a small elite that controlled access to those resources benefited and profited, while the majority of the country did not benefit from their own natural resources. Camacho's numerous family members were deeply involved in the gas industry. Evo Morales was democratically elected first until 2006. He comes in as a former social movement leader from a grassroots political party that emerged out of the indigenous communities in Bolivia that were organizing labor movements and organizing their communities. And they created this political party called the Movement Towards Social. Farmer quickly becomes a leader. And he's thrust into politics, not necessarily because he wants to be a leader, but because he recognizes the importance of the indigenous community and the working class having a voice in this country. And this is also a country where ownership of the natural gas has been a major contentious political issue. In fact, the opposition candidate, the right-wing opposition figure in the October 20th presidential election that Evo Morales won, and we can talk more about that, where he was falsely accused without any evidence of fraud. In this election, the opposition candidate, Carlos Mesa, was previously president and was actually ousted in a series of protests over the ownership of natural gas in Bolivia, because largely indigenous working class protest movements demanded that the natural gas be nationalized and be used to benefit the population. Of course, Evo Morales did exactly that when he entered office. And in the past 13 years, in 3 presidential terms, he has, through nationalizing the natural gas and the lithium reserves, and lithium, another major natural resource in Bolivia, and dispossessing these elite oligarchs of the wealth that they gained through exploiting their country's natural resources. He used that wealth to fund social programs and education. He created a universal healthcare system similar to the kind of Medicare for All system that's now being discussed in the US, which he implemented years ago and was praised by the United Nations for helping increase public health standards in the country. And then finally, Evo Morales, in 13 years, managed to cut unemployment in half and drop poverty overall by 40% and absolute poverty by 62%. So, or extreme poverty by 62%. So it's not a surprise to see that figures like Camacho, whom we can talk more about, but we should understand that these are the figures who come from this elite who were dispossessed by the social movements led by Evo Morales, and ever since have been trying desperately, with the help, by the way, of the U.S. Embassy, of other U.S. government organizations like the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, and with the right-wing governments regionally, specifically Colombia and Brazil. They all conspired together with the military and police forces that Evo never really controlled to overthrow him, the democratically elected president. And we see the results now, which is violence in the streets, attacks on indigenous communities and women, and we see an attempt to impose a fake unelected president by an extreme fascist, frankly, figure. This is yet another extremist who declared herself interim president on Tuesday, November 12th, named Janine Añez. And the first thing she said as president is she walked up to the presidential, holding a giant Bible, and said, "The Bible is returning to the presidential palace."
Well, I mean, does anybody back her? Who is the president right now? Is she? What you described is a total model of U.S. coup in Latin America. It's happened so many times like that. But this seems to be different. Usually a military figure, a junta, would take over, promise elections, and maybe they would never happen 15 years later. But now we've got this crazy woman with the Bible, I saw the pictures, declaring herself president like Guaido. Is this a new U.S. model? Are they backing her?
Absolutely. There's no question. The U.S. government is backing her. The Brazilian regime, led by President Jair Bolsonaro, who is one of the most explicit neo-fascists in the entire region. I mean, this is a guy who campaigned pledging to imprison, kill, and exile leftists, who said he's a strong supporter of the Brazilian military dictatorship. He's called for restoring it. And he famously said that his biggest problem with the Chilean dictator, Pinochet, Augusto Pinochet, he claimed that Pinochet didn't kill enough people. So this is the leader in Brazil. Immediately, Brazil recognized her as the supposed president. Colombia. So, of course, the regional allies I talked about who were behind the coup are recognizing her. Now, you raise a good point that historically, with many of these military coups throughout the 20th century, backed by the US and right-wing oligarchs to overthrow progressive presidents and leaders in Latin America, they were often led by the military. And I think this is an exception. She is simply the figurehead, but the military are the forces that are still preventing the government, the legitimate government led by the Movement Toward Socialism Party, from exercising power. And we saw this, in fact, today, November 18th, to recognize this woman, Jeanine Áñez, as the supposed president. And the majority of the Congress in Bolivia, of the Senate, consists of members of the Moving Towards Socialism party who were democratically elected. They control over half the seats, nearly 2/3. And they were systematically imprisoned and detained, terrorized, forced to resign through violent acts of terror. For instance, several members were forced to resign because their family members were kidnapped, and then the far right terrorists told them, if you don't resign, we're going to kill your family members, which, you know, people have been referring to as the Pablo Escobar method. And we saw today video of the actual president of the Senate, who is a young woman from the Movement Towards Socialism party. According to the Constitution, she should be the president right now because the president and vice president resigned after the military basically told them to. So it was a coup. It wasn't a voluntary resignation, but they did resign. And according to the Constitution, she should be next in line to take the presidency. But the military forces prevented her from assuming the presidency. They physically attacked her and blocked her from entering the Senate, of which she was voted the president. She is the leader constitutionally of the Senate. And the military forces blocked other members of the Movement Towards Socialism party, preventing them from entering for the vote. So they had a fake rigged vote to recognize this woman, Áñez, as the supposed president. They are calling her the constitutional president. Of course, she's not constitutional, which is a complete farce. What we're seeing is that she is really the figurehead politically, but the real people calling the shots, of course, are still the military and still the police forces. They were the ones who turned against Evo. And as we showed in another report at the Gray Zone, published by our colleague Jeb Sprague, 6 of these military leaders were trained by the US military at the School of the Americas, including the top leader, the head of the military himself, Williams Galiman, who was trained by the US military at the School of the Americas. He was also the military attaché in Washington, D.C. before Evo Morales became president. And there are also many other links between the military and the police forces in Bolivia, and also the FBI in the United States. And there's quite a bit of circumstantial evidence to think that suggests that these FBI forces were coordinating with the CIA, of course, to work along with these military and police officials who have led the coup in Bolivia.
And the New York Times in an editorial supported all of this that you've just described, which is all you need to know about the Times. But what you also describe again is a traditional coup in Latin America, but they seem to have learned maybe that just doesn't have the right look anymore for the 21st century. So we'll find some civilian in the parliament and install that person in the horrible way you just described by keeping the actual legitimate successor physically outside of the Senate. Again, one interesting thing about Camacho is he, 3 months before, you write, and you and Max write, 3 months before the coup, he'd worked to try to dissolve the electoral commission of the country. So, and this woman, as you say, didn't come out of nowhere either. She was probably prepared as well. So I find that extraordinary that this guy nobody ever heard of, and I don't know how many people in Bolivia had heard of him, is now considered the leader of the opposition when he was doing things three months before. So clearly this was planned. And I want to know what his role is in this coup government right now.
Well, it's not.
He acted like, as you say, he was the muscle. His group was the muscle. It was like Azov Battalion or Right Sector in Ukraine. I mean, it was like, use these guys just to get into power, but then they don't actually have power. Is that the case with Camacho as well?
I was just about to make the same analogy with Ukraine.
Right.
It's pretty similar to the tactics we saw in Euromaidan, where the muscle behind the coup that broke the back of the democratically elected Yanukovych government were these fascist forces. In the case of Bolivia, they are once again literal fascists. This is not just an insult used by the left to call anyone, no, they're actual fascists. Camacho, when he was young, he got his start in politics in his 20s as the leader of a group in Santa Cruz. Santa Cruz, by the way, is the largest city in Bolivia, and it's the kind of financial center. It's the whitest, most elite, richest part of the country. There are very few indigenous people there. The indigenous people, which are the base of Evo Morales' Santa Cruz, has had a secession movement, what they call an autonomy movement. It's essentially a secessionist movement for many years. And since the election of Evo Morales, the US government has been strongly supporting this secessionist movement to try to create they call an autonomous region in Santa Cruz, the richest area, similar to the kind of tactics the US and NATO encouraged to break up and balkanize Yugoslavia, encouraging Croatia, the richest country inside the former Yugoslavia federation, to break off and form its own independent nation. That's essentially the strategy that was being pursued. And Camacho was the leader of the main civil organization pushing for secession, so-called autonomy in the region, which is called the Pro-Santa Cruz Committee. And the youth wing of this group, he also previously led as vice president, which is called the Youth Union of Santa Cruz. This is an explicitly neo-fascist organization that is modeled after the style of Francoist, fascist, Falangist forces in Spain leading up to World War II and after World War II. What happened is that many of these European fascists after World War II, when they lost the war, many of them had allied with Nazi Germany, especially in Croatia. The Ustasha were a fascist pro-Nazi group. And after the war, many of them fled to Latin America. Many people might have heard of the Nazi German colonies in Argentina, in Chile under Pinochet. Well, in Bolivia, there was a significant Croatian fascist population who had been the Ustasha members, and they came to Bolivia and they moved to Santa Cruz, and they became economic elites, and they helped establish these organizations like the Youth Union of Santa Cruz, where I went through some of their old documents and videos, their documentaries, and I speak Spanish, and I was going through listening to what they were saying, and I found video clips from their own documentaries that they themselves produced that show all of their youth cadre walking around doing Nazi salutes, fascist salutes at their arms, with their arms at their chests. I mean, this is their own materials. This is not material released by they're proud of this. They boast of this. They're explicitly fascist. And Camacho comes out of these organizations and was pushing for secession. And when Evo Morales was elected in 2006, the years after, we have WikiLeaks files, US government cables published by WikiLeaks and by Julian Assange, who is, of course, being tortured and imprisoned because he's published this truthful information. And in those files, we see that the US Embassy was regularly meeting with some of these secessionist leaders, was supporting them with money from groups like the US Agency for International Development, USAID. And also, we found in our report, I found US government cables we published at the Gray Zone showing how the US Embassy and the Charge d'Affaires were also meeting with Carlos Mesa, the opposition presidential candidate, this neoliberal privatizing figure. So many of these figures have long-standing ties to the US government, and they were being used throughout the Evo Morales administration to try to weaken and balkanize the country using the kind of same tactics used in Yugoslavia and Ukraine. And he was really the muscle. Now we'll see what happens going forward. I don't think he's going to disappear. He's certainly not. I think he might be one of those figures behind the scenes who plays an important political role, but doesn't necessarily have a role in public life. Because let's keep in mind here, Bolivia is 2/3 roughly indigenous. This is a country where these light-skinned European descendant elites are not popular. And in fact, if you look at the figures who ran in the presidential elections against Evo Morales, they often claimed to be left-wing candidates. Carlos Mesa ran from a party that calls itself part of the revolutionary left. Of course, that's not what they are. They're neoliberals, but he's a kind of Obama-style neoliberal who says that we're going to bring hope and change, and I'm a progressive, but I also support getting business done. The actual far-right flank of the opposition, who was the muscle behind the coup, is extremely unpopular and could never win more than a few percent in the election. That's why they had to take power through a military coup, because they would have been maybe fine with a Carlos Mesa presidency. And there's documents showing that they wanted Carlos Mesa because he would privatize the natural gas again. He would privatize the lithium reserves. And Bolivia has 50 to 70% of the world's known lithium reserves, which is used for batteries in phones, computers, electric cars. It's a very important mineral. So Mesa has been the kind pro-business neoliberal. But for the Trump administration, for the Bolsonaro administration in Brazil, for the Ivan Duque administration in Colombia, these are all far-right figures. For them, even Carlos Mesa was not enough. Just as Enrique Capriles in Venezuela, who is the kind of more mainstream, slightly more moderate opposition, still a neoliberal, but not a fascist. Just as for the Trump administration, Capriles was not enough. They wanted these far-right shock forces, just like the forces that led the coup in Ukraine. So this is not a new tactic, and it's certainly not something that the Trump administration pioneered. It goes back many decades for bipartisan U.S. foreign policy. But we see, this pattern continued once again, where the fascists are the shock troops, and what they really do is they create this political void, they break the state, and they open this void that is then filled with the neoliberals, with the privatizers, with North American corporations. And you can bet that in the next few years, we're going to see reports of North American corporations exploiting the gas and lithium reserves in.
Well, that brings me to my first question for you, and that is that, we refer to these policies and the policies of these governments as neoliberal, but to what extent, mentioning the fact that Bolivia is 2/3 indigenous, to what extent is this also neocolonial, in your opinion?
100%. It is absolutely neocolonial. And of course, those two things are by no means mutually exclusive. In many ways, they go hand in glove with each other. And we've seen the explicitly racist anti-indigenous rhetoric of many of these figures, which is a sign that clearly it's neocolonial. As an example, this woman, Jeanine Áñez, who is this supposed unelected president, she had multiple tweets she now has deleted, but they've been archived, and you can find them all over Twitter, where she referred to the indigenous population as satanic. And that's actually a trope that goes on a lot with the far-right Christian forces in Latin America. Your viewers might remember that Efraín Ríos Montt, who was the far-right Christian extremist dictator in Guatemala in the 1980s, backed staunchly by the U.S. government, led at the time by Ronald Reagan, Ríos Montt was carrying out genocide against the indigenous Maya population with the backing of the U.S. and of Israel. And he was an evangelical extremist who saw the indigenous population as polytheists, as satanic. Similarly, we see the same rhetoric from some of these forces in Bolivia, although interestingly, many of them actually aren't evangelical. They're actually far-right Catholics in this kind of Francoist Spanish Opus Dei style politics. And in another tweet that she posted, she said that this is the supposed president of the coup regime. She said that the Indians must leave the city. She said the city is not for the Indians. They need to go back to the countryside. So we see explicitly, they're not hiding this idea that Bolivia belongs to the European descendant population. By the way, many of whom it's funny, not funny, it's sadistic and crazy how this fascist ideology works, because many of these people in the US wouldn't actually be considered white, but in the context of Bolivia, which is a majority indigenous country, these are people who have partial European ancestry and are lighter skinned. And in the case of Áñez, she dyes her hair blonde, and we see this kind of anti-indigenous racism reflected in their own appearance. And then I of course need to mention the fact that Bolivia technically has a dual flag. It has two flags, because in 2009, Evo Morales, who was the first indigenous president ever in Bolivia's history, Evo Morales passed a new constitution in a referendum. And this is a very revolutionary, progressive constitution that guarantees healthcare for all citizens, that guarantees all of these important things that in the US, are a pipe dream. They were guaranteed in this constitution that was voted on democratically by the Bolivian populace. 61% of the population supported it in the referendum. And in this constitution, it also declared Bolivia to be what is called a plurinational state. Now, what that means is that before, Bolivia had been specifically a Catholic nation. It was not a secular nation, and it was a nation that didn't recognize the indigenous communities as part of the political fabric of life. So in this constitution, this new one, it recognized indigenous communities being part of the plurinational nation, and all of their languages, along with Spanish, as the languages of the country. And in to that, national flag of Bolivia is of course still the flag, but also the Wiphala flag, which is a square flag. It looks kind of like a quilt, and it's like a rainbow quilt with white squares. That indigenous flag used by the Andean indigenous communities is recognized as the dual flag. And police and military forces on their patches on their arms, you can see that they have both of those flags there. And there's been a lot of video posted of some of the military and police coup leaders who have been cutting off the indigenous Wapala flag. And there have been videos published of some of these right-wing violent mobs who are attacking left-wing elected politicians and terrorizing them and burning down their homes and taking their family members hostage. They've also been burning the Wiphala indigenous flag, which is the perfect symbol for what their actual politics are. They're symbolically destroying the symbol of the representation and inclusion of indigenous communities in Bolivian society, and saying to the entire world that once again, we are returning the rich elites who are descendants of the colonialists back to power, and we want the rest of the poor working class indigenous communities to just go back into the mountains.
How stable do you think this new, fascist government is? Do you think that it's going to last moving forward?
It's hard to say. It's of course very hard to say. I think back in 1973, on the first September 11th attack, if you will, when the CIA helped overthrow Chile's democratically elected socialist president, Salvador Allende, I think a lot of people probably assumed that the Pinochet regime wouldn't be able to stay in power. And look, he stayed in power for 20 years. So it's hard to tell what could happen. Of course, the situation is different today, but, throughout the world, we've seen this rise of neo-fascist groups, many of which, unsurprisingly, are supported by NATO and by the US and are weaponized as proxy forces to attack official enemies, governments that are insufficiently compliant and too independent for the State Department's taste. So we'll see what happens. It's hard to predict the future, but what I can say is that right now there are massive protests. There's a huge uprising going on, not only of grassroots indigenous communities and working class, not even just indigenous. We should keep in mind that it's true that the majority of indigenous communities supported AVO, but there were a lot of non-indigenous people who were progressive and who benefited from his social programs that helped the poor and that gave people healthcare and education, who support his movement and his party. And they're in the streets. Some of them actually have weapons and are defending their communities from the police and military forces who were trained by the US and who are viciously repressing them. So this was the thing that AVO wanted to avoid. When the military called for him to resign, which was it was a coup, but they were telling him, if you don't resign, there's going to be violence. So AVO said, fine, I'm going to resign, even though I'm the elected president, because I don't want there to be a civil war. I don't want a Syria to happen in my country. But of course, the military forces are the ones carrying out the majority of the violence. So we'll see where things go, but I should just stress this point that just like the far-right opposition in Venezuela. Venezuela is a country I know very well. This year alone, nearly 5 months there. And in Venezuela, the far-right opposition is not popular, even among the kind of upper class, more elite figures. Many of them are not comfortable with the far-right opposition. They prefer the more neoliberal, slightly more moderate characters who are not burning Chavistas alive, like we saw in Venezuela. So the opposition forces in Venezuela, one of the reasons the coup failed is because they were extremely unpopular, also because the Chavista movement had a strong support base in the military, and Hugo Chavez was himself from the military. So I think that's one of the other factors that Evo Morales did not have on its side. This is a coca farmer who never really controlled his own military, never controlled his own police forces. But the point is that in both of these countries, the far-right opposition is very unpopular, and the coup failed in Venezuela. So there certainly is a possibility that it could fail in Bolivia, although, again, the military factor is the major determining factor in this case.
I'm sure that US and corporate interests have been sort of, hoping for this type of event for a long time. Why do you think this coup was attempted now versus maybe a different election where Morales has been, in power for a long time? Do you think that this would have been possible without Bolsonaro? Do you think that that has played a role in this, or, to what extent do you think that what is the role of the timing in this coup?
Well, if you look at the coup and you trace back to see whose fingerprints all over it, who are the biggest culprits, of course, number one is the US. But in addition to that, the Organization of American States played another leading role, as a vehicle of US soft power. This is an organization that is nearly 2/3 funded by Washington, that was created by the United States during the Cold War as a coalition of anti-communist governments in Latin America, working with at the leadership of the US to overthrow other socialist forces. So the OAS played a leading role, and specifically Secretary General Luiz Almagro, who just has no credibility in Latin America. He's a total puppet of Washington. He defended the US invasion, for instance, of Panama, and claimed that it in fact was not an invasion, that it was a humanitarian intervention to restore democracy. So the OAS played a leading role. And then, of course, as you mentioned, the other regional actors played a leading role as well, Brazil and Colombia. Of course, in Brazil, you're right that Bolsonaro, that's definitely a significant factor. And a factor I haven't even mentioned yet is another oligarch who we discuss in our piece, Branko Marinkovic, who, his name clearly sounds very, very Latino. I mean, this is a guy he's a dual citizen of Bolivia and Croatia, and his family members Croatia after World War II. He claims they were not Nazi collaborators. Even some of his supporters are skeptical, and they suspect that his family members were members of the Ustasha fascist forces, and they fled after the Holocaust and fled to Bolivia, where they became elites there. Branko Marinkovic, where does he live? He lives in Brazil, where he has been funding and supporting many of the opposition forces in Bolivia, but in exile. He is a strong supporter of Bolsonaro, and he's regularly quoted still in the right-wing media leading up to the coup. He was regularly quoted, and we have evidence that Camacho, in fact, met with the chancellor, with the foreign minister of Brazil before the coup. So definitely, we also have audio recordings, 16 audio recordings that were leaked of opposition figures in Bolivia who were talking about how they had support from the US, and specifically they claimed they had support from Senators Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, and Bob Menendez, and the Trump administration. And then they also claimed they had support from Bolsonaro himself in Brazil. And then finally, the other actor I need to talk about is Colombia, because in Colombia, there's also a very far-right president, Iván Duque. Now, Juan Manuel Santos, his predecessor, was certainly still a right-wing, U.S. close ally, but Santos was a little more independent, not as extreme. He, for instance, signed a peace deal with the FARC, and he played a little nice with the pink tide, not because he necessarily wanted to, but because many of the governments in the region, including Brazil at the time, had progressive governments that were elected, and then many of which were overthrown in parliamentary coups in the case of Brazil, or literal coups in the case of Honduras. And in Colombia, this new president, Iván Duque, is very far right. He follows in the line of Álvaro Uribe, who is this far-right figure in Colombian politics, who was a kind of pre-Trumpian figure who ushered in this new era of far-right, very violent politics, specifically against the leftist insurgency in the country. And he has also played a role in the coup in Bolivia. In our article, I actually found a photo of Camacho, this Bolivian so-called coup leader, meeting with Iván Duque, the far-right Colombian president, back in May. So months before the coup, months before the election. And why were they meeting? Because Camacho went to Colombia because he was doing a campaign trying to get signatures and then appealing to other countries in the region to block Evo Morales from being the presidential candidate in the October 20th election. He went to Colombia and gave these signatures to the Colombian far-right president, Iván Duque, and he was petitioning and working with Iván Duque, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. they were trying to file a case in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which is an arm of the OAS, which is funded by the U.S. and is closely allied to the U.S. Fidel Castro famously called it the Confederation of Yankees and their puppets. In the American rights, they were trying to, Colombia and Brazil and the Bolivian opposition were trying to block Evo months before the coup. So there's so many pieces of evidence showing had the support of the Colombian government at the highest levels, including the president, of the Brazilian government at the highest levels, including Bolsonaro, and the Venezuelan opposition. There are photos he posted on Twitter. He didn't even hide it. Camacho meeting with Gustavo Tarre, and Tarre is the fake Venezuelan coup regime's ambassador to the Organization of American States, because the OAS doesn't recognize the legitimate government, the democratically elected government of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. Instead, it recognizes the coup regime backed by the US, mostly residing in Washington. And Gustavo Tarre took photos with Camacho in front of a giant painting of the coup leader, Juan Guaido. And in the tweet, which says everything, Camacho wrote 2 months before the presidential election, he said, "Thank you, Colombia. Thank you, Venezuela, Guaido, and thank you, Brazil." So he was publicly thanking his imperial international patrons, the sponsors of this coup, months before the coup actually took place. I mean, it's all in the open.
Ben, I mean, it's incredible the treacherous environment in which Morales ruled for these many years. That this was always in the background, was always in danger. I've seen him criticized for not having taken control of the military and the police and installing his own people and purging them. Was that something that was possible for him to have done, and he just failed to do it?
Well, it's hard to say, and I've been saying that I'm hesitant to criticize people who, in the global South, who are enduring all of these assassination attempts. I didn't even mention those. The 2008 assassination attempt linked to the U.S., allegedly carried out by some of these same fascist groups. And this oligarch I mentioned, Branko Marinkovic, he fled the country because he was accused of trying to assassinate Evo Morales. So, with all of these security threats, violent terror, internal sabotage, it's hard to say what he could or should have done. But what I can say is that one of the major weaknesses that Evo had from day one, and one of the reasons this coup took place and it hasn't worked in Venezuela, is because he never really had support within the military and police forces. Now, Hugo Chavez came out of the military in Venezuela. He, in fact, attempted an uprising in the 1990s that failed, and he was imprisoned for several years, and he became a very popular figure while he was in prison, a very progressive nationalist figure who was not yet a socialist, by the way. And then finally, Hugo Chavez won election in 1998, and he ushered in the Bolivarian Revolution. And as part of that revolution, he created a new police force, which was a very revolutionary police force. And, like I said, I spent a lot of time in Venezuela, and the Venezuelan police are different from the U.S. police. It's like night and day. Even as a white guy, and I'm the person who's attacked the least by police in the U.S., I'm still terrified by the NYPD. They're really kind of like an occupying army. Whereas in Venezuela, the majority of the police force, many are women, but majority are dark-skinned, poor and working class people who entered the police force in the era of Chavismo as a kind of progressive form of nationalism and duty to their country. And similarly, the military has always remained a major bastion of Chavismo. So Evo Morales could never really replicate that in the same way. This was, again, a farmer who came from social movements. And I think it's also similar to the situation in Brazil, where Lula da Silva, one of the most beloved figures in all of Brazil, when he left office, he had an 87% approval rating. So he had widespread love among the population, but the military, which were the forces behind, of course, the dictatorship for decades in Brazil, the military forces never really were penetrated by the Workers' Party. They still remained a bastion of this kind of right-wing politics that was closely allied with and working with Washington and with other right-wing allies. So, the situation in Brazil and Bolivia are pretty similar. And I think the reason that countries like Cuba and Venezuela have been able to avoid these coups is because they have had the military under their control, and they don't have a military that acts somewhat independent of the Americas.
Yes, that wonderful school in Georgia that has such a long history in all those coups. He survived.
It's affectionately referred to as the School of the Assassins.
Yeah, yeah, that's what they teach there, don't they? Torture methods, etc. A school most American people probably don't even know exists. But Morales did serve 3 terms, and there was the controversy of him seeking another term, that the Constitution didn't allow this. Went to the Supreme Court. Can you fill us in on that part of the story? Because that's one of the reasons why somebody like the New York Times, who thinks they're respectable, could criticize him, that he wanted too much power for himself.
Well, look, it's funny hearing people say that he wanted all this power for himself, because he certainly wasn't benefiting himself from it. What's interesting is there are all these videos of the far-right opposition forces attacking and ransacking and pillaging his house, Evo Morales' house. And what's incredible about these videos is they go in his house and you look, and it looks like a pretty modest house. He's got a TV, he's got a kitchen. They go upstairs and he has a treadmill and some weights, and they say, oh, he's got a gym. And then you look at his bedroom. I mean, he has a very modest house. For many people in the US, it would be at most a kind of lower middle class, maybe just middle class house. This is a guy who lived very modestly and who just posted a photo of how now he's returned to, sleeping in this kind of indigenous way on this hammock. So, part of that is part of course, the kind of image he cultivated, like Pepe Mujica in Uruguay, as many of the people, salt of the earth. But in the case of Evo Morales, it's true that this is a guy who was a poor coca farmer who grew up in, a dirt poor family with tons of siblings, some of whom died when he was growing up because they didn't have health care. So the idea that he was just in power because he was power hungry and always just wanted more is ridiculous, considering he spent his 13 years in his tenure as president supporting and empowering the poor, reducing poverty, creating these social programs. He's the exact opposite of many of these other leaders throughout the world. I mean, Trump's an easy one, but many of these other figures, even Obama, who after leaving office, Obama was hanging out with the billionaire Richard Branson and saying nothing about Trump. So, the idea that he was in this for power is ridiculous. Now, you can say that you criticize the idea that he should run another term for office, but keep in mind that Evo Morales was, again, the most popular president in Bolivia's history. He was the only president who ever in an election got more than 50% of the vote multiple times. And even in the final years when, they were facing some more issues, and especially some economic issues, Bolivia still had the highest rate of economic growth, one of the highest rates in Latin America. It was one of the most equitable countries, and he still got 47% of the vote in the first round of the election. That's just the first round. If you think about a US presidential election, even considering the people who or not considering rather the people who are disenfranchised, millions of people by mass incarceration, but if you look at the actual voting population and you consider that only 53% of eligible voters participated in the US election, that means that Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump only each got about 1/4 of the entire population. So even according to that metric, which is a bad metric because everyone who voted for Hillary and voted for Trump, they often voted for them because they hated the other candidate. It's not because 1/4 of the country likes them both. If you look at Evo, 47% of the entire country voted for him in the first round. So that's a sign that this is a guy who still has a major base. And it's true that there aren't many other leaders who could have potentially succeeded him. So it's understandable that he would have sought another term. And he did it entirely legally. The Supreme Court gave him permission to run another term, and he did so totally within the confines of the Constitution. Now, it is true, to be fair, that he had a referendum on whether or not that he could run again. But what's not talked about, it's true, he did technically lose the referendum, but the referendum was extremely narrow. It was about 51% to 49. It was determined by several thousand votes. It was very close. So because it was so close, That's why he went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court was ultimately the ones that said, yes, you can run again. So it was entirely legal. That there, from the perspective of the Bolivian constitution, there's no question that it was legal.
Now, the role of the OAS, I've read that they recommended this two-step election, and that Bolivia accepted that. What role did that have anything to do with why they say that this was? You write that there was no evidence in the OAS report. I presume you read the OAS report, and they don't.
It's very short. Yeah, it's very short. They don't provide any solid evidence, and I would never claim to be an expert on this kind of thing, but there are legitimate experts who have studied the OAS so-called report, which is it's not a report, it's a press release. The OAS released a press release, and they claimed that they couldn't determine the votes because there were too many irregularities. They didn't cite examples of those irregularities. They simply said there are too many irregularities. Now, an actual expert crunched the numbers and did a statistical model of the publicly available voting data, which anyone in the world can access. It was released by the Bolivian Electoral Council, which, as we discussed earlier, has been repeatedly attacked by the right-wing opposition. They not only before the coup, they were trying to force the Electoral Commission to resign. And after the presidential election, there were violent riots, and they burnt down offices of the TSE, the Electoral Council. And after the coup, the first thing they did, one of the first things, was they arrested the president and vice president of the Electoral Council, and then used the threat of violence to force all of the other members of the TSE to resign. So they clearly didn't want the Electoral Council talking. Also, there is many videos of the right-wing opposition forces after the October 20th election, when they were violently rioting in the streets. They ransacked the offices of the TSE, and before burning them down, they took all the votes out and burned the votes. So one of the reasons that you couldn't actually have your own independent vote count after is because many of the votes were burnt by the right-wing opposition. But anyway, the point is that the Center for Economic and Policy Research is really one of the only good think tanks in DC. A very small think tank. It's run by respected economists, specifically Mark Weisbrot, who has also worked with Jeffrey Sachs, who formerly was a neoliberal privatizer who helped privatize all of the former Soviet Warsaw Pact countries, and later, saw the error in his ways and has kind of apologized on entirely. But anyway, this think tank published a very important study, and they're the only ones, to my knowledge thus far, who have actually done a statistical model looking at the return of the votes throughout the night, and then looking at the polling done beforehand, which mapped, for the most part, on the votes. And what this comes down to is that there was a lie spread by the opposition that was dutifully parroted by corporate media. They claimed that on the night of the voting, that the voting went out for a few hours, and then suddenly the vote count came back, and Evo Morales was leading. Now, that is not true. It's in some cases an intentional, and in some cases an understandable distortion of what actually happened. What happened is that it was a twofold factor. The first part is that the figure that people are talking about was not the official count. It was an unofficial estimation, a tally that wasn't an actual count of the votes. It was simply, estimating based on the regions. And in addition to that, throughout the night, the beginning of the voting happened in the urban areas, which is the base of support for the opposition. And then later in the night, the votes in the rural areas, which is the base for Evo Morales' support, came in later. And of course, as they came in and more people were voting for Evo, the distance between Evo and the next candidate increased to nearly 11%. Now, what's interesting, the final point to make about this is that the opposition never disputed that Evo Morales won the election in the first round. What they dispute is that he won it by 10%. Because according to the Bolivian constitution, to avoid a runoff election, you have to either get 50% of the vote in the first round, which Evo has done in the past, but he got 47%, so he nearly got 50. Or you have to get at least 10% more than the next candidate in the first round. he got nearly 11%, about 10.67%. And that was, of course, enough. It was 600,000 votes. It was enough to push him to victory in the first round. But what's interesting is that even if you dispute that fact, you claim he only won by 9%, the opposition is still conceding the fact that Evo Morales won with nearly 50% of the vote. They don't dispute that fact because the OAS doesn't dispute that fact because it's an incontrovertible fact. So when Evo Morales was facing all of the threats of violence and rioting, in order to try to calm the situation in the country, in order to show the world that indeed he has democratic legitimacy, on the morning of the coup, when the OAS released its so-called report, its press release, and he said that he would abide by what the OAS said, the OAS called for a new round of elections, a runoff. And Evo Morales said, fine, if you want it, I will go to a runoff. We'll have a second round of the election because I'm confident that I can win. Well, what happened? Two things happened. One, the opposition said, okay, fine, we'll have a new election, but you can't be a candidate. So it's a clear sign that they don't want an actual fair election because the opposition knows they can't win. They can only win if he's not the candidate. In the same way that Bolsonaro could only win because Sergio Moro, who has many links to the US government and probably is a CIA asset, he was the judge leading this so-called anti-corruption car wash scandal in operation in Brazil. He imprisoned Lula on what we now know are completely fake, specious allegations of corruption, specifically in order to weaken the Workers' Party, which didn't have time to get a new well-known candidate. And that's the only way that Bolsonaro could win. And by the way, I say he was probably a CIA asset because Sergio Moro was then later, he was rewarded by Bolsonaro by becoming his justice minister. And then the first time they visited the US, Bolsonaro and Sergio Moro, they immediately went to CIA headquarters for a secret meeting. So what were they doing there? Well, maybe we'll find out in a few years. But back to Bolivia, they carried out the same strategy. It's the same kind of legal warfare they call lawfare, where they didn't want Evo Morales to participate in the election because they knew that he would win. So they tried to use every single tactic to prevent him from participating. And then when he agreed to a new round of the election, they said, fine, we can't win. We'll go with the final option, which is the military coup.
It's just so distressing what you're saying. One image at the very beginning of yours, Max's story, when Camacho enters, I guess, Morales' house, and he kneels down with a Bible and he drives out the Andean Mother Earth Spirit and says that Bolivia belongs to Christ. I mean, the racism here, the hatred I just described earlier of the indigenous people, the self-worth that the belief in these white people who are running this now, thinking that they somehow is from God, that they should rule and they deserve the vast majority of the resources of the country. And you're going to, unfortunately, probably, if there is no change, see all those advances that Morales made start to reverse themselves in terms of the poverty, the education, literacy, perhaps even. And this is what they want to do, to destroy population, simply to take more of it for themselves. And they somehow think that they've been ordained by God to do that. I don't know how you fight that kind of thing. It's just incredibly awful.
Well, I made a point on Twitter that we have a lot of historical parallels of this. I mentioned Efrain Rios Montt in Guatemala and the evangelical forces who were the major constituency that propelled Bolsonaro to office, of course, after imprisoning Lula, but the evangelicals were a major force there. And I think there's a great parallel, not a great, but great's the wrong word. I mean, an accurate historical parallel because it's something very bad. But for decades throughout the Cold War, the US and British intelligence agencies were weaponizing and often supporting on and off many Islamist extremist forces in the Middle East and South Asia. And I think those are interesting parallels to these kinds of fascist shock troops like we saw in Latin America or the Azov battalion and right sector in Ukraine, where for many years after World War II, leading up to World War II, by the way, in the 20s and 30s, some of these fascist groups sometimes had on and off relations with the US and Britain and France and other Western imperial powers. And then after World War II, of course, there's famously Operation Gladio, where many of the former fascists were rehabilitated and were, essentially, if there was ever a war, a hot war with the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, that NATO forces would activate those former Nazi, former fascist sleeper cells to fight against the evil atheist communists. So we see many of the same ideas exported historically. I mean, of course, Russiagate is bringing back a lot of the stuff in the US, but if you look at the Middle East, I think what happened in Syria and Libya is a very close parallel to what's happening now in Latin America, where Gaddafi has a complex legacy, and he didn't have the same democratic legitimacy that someone like Evo did. Gaddafi wasn't elected, but he was a progressive, popular, anti-imperialist leader who led a revolution to overthrow an imperialist-backed monarchy, which is never mentioned, that Libya had a colony that was backed by a monarchy in European colonialism. And he ushered in this revolution that made women a major part of Libyan society in a part of the world where women, have traditionally not played a role in society. And he used the oil wealth of Libya to benefit the majority of the population. And Libya had the highest standard of living in all of Africa. And what happened in 2011? NATO forces backed Salafi jihadists allied with Al-Qaeda, who later became ISIS, who were extremely racist, who carried out ethnic cleansing of Black Africans in Libya. And then they broke the back of the Libyan government. They destroyed the Libyan state, and they killed Gaddafi in a brutal killing. So that, and of course, Syria is a very similar example where, these Western so-called democracies supported Al-Qaeda and their allies that became ISIS to try to overthrow one of the only secular governments in the region that provides equal rights for all religious and ethnic minorities, that provides universal health care and education, that still has a strong state that intervenes in the economy. Don't forget that when the US overthrew the Iraqi government, after supporting Saddam for years, the first thing they did is they imposed Chilean-style Chicago Boys neoliberalism, privatizing everything and destroying all state institutions in Iraq. So, the Middle East and Latin America have very different historical and political contexts, but many of the same tactics are being used. And these Christian fascists in Bolivia who are storming in the presidential palace that Camacho was in. It wasn't even his house. It wasn't Evo's house. It was the presidential palace, and saying that Bolivia belongs to Christ. Those are the same in their respective historical context, and political context. Those are the same kinds of people who join Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria and who behead Alawites and declare that they're purging the country of the Rafida and creating an Islamic state. I mean, it's not a one-to-one analogy, but, in their respective contexts, it's the same CIA tactics of counterinsurgency, regime change, and coup-mongering that have been perfected over many decades.
Go ahead, Joe.
I was going to say, I think it's precisely the same thing. The Contras and Al-Qaeda playing same role, and the same goal is to, as the neoliberal economic system, to benefit very few elites and impoverish everyone else. And they can't invade every country, so they're going to use these kinds of proxies. And it's exactly the same thing. And that's why Evo Morales said he didn't want his country to become like Syria. He knows what he's talking about. Elizabeth.
I was just going to add that I think it's one of the things that sickens me the most about what you're discussing, Ben, is the fact that not only do we have this extreme right-wing type of takeover happening, in many different countries, you have media in the United States and in the West in general that manages to coin itself as liberal and leftist, but either ignores or basically supports these takeovers, discussing Libya, discussing, the Latin American situation. It's sickening. I mean, what do you think of that? Why are they able to still get away with that?
Well, I think it comes back to, not to rehash cliches, but what Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky wrote about now almost 30 years ago in Manufacturing Consent, that the role of corporate media institutions in capitalist society is to reflect the interests of course, the corporations that control them, but also ultimately the state itself, because the state is what guarantees that those corporations can continue business as usual, can have new opportunities for investments and profits in the future. So, you know, every time we have a discussion about media in the US, we have to always act that 95% of the news media is controlled by 6 corporations. And that's almost never discussed, especially in corporate media. You know, they act as though their goal is to inform people. Their goal is not to inform people. If you are in a shareholder meeting of CNN, they never talk about informing people. That's not a priority. It's not even on the list of priorities. Their goal is return on investment. Their goal is advertising. Their goal is increasing viewers. And their goal is also not getting in trouble, not biting the hand that feeds them. And you all know this at Consortium News. Believe me, at the Gray Zone, we have faced a lot of repercussions for our reporting, whether that's economically throughout my career as a journalist, but also, I mean, I'm not even that old, through my short career of 7 or 8 years doing journalism, the economic repercussions are huge, but worse than that are the political repercussions. You know, Max Blumenthal, my colleague and the editor of the Gray Zone, is facing charges, completely fake, fabricated charges from the Venezuelan opposition with the help of the US government that are trying to imprison him on these bogus charges, clearly because they're trying to silence his dissentious reporting and his factual reporting on the crimes of the Venezuelan opposition forces. So, you know, it's a cliche, but it's something that everyone knows instinctively, that corporate media outlets really act as an extension of state interests, and not even just state interests, specifically intelligence agencies. And you all at Consortium News have done a really good job of showing throughout this whole Russiagate bogus scandal how Russiagate was led by the intelligence services, which used the corporate media outlets as a vehicle to launder disinformation for political collateral. And they worked hand in glove, where intelligence agencies would leak these kind of scoops that they wanted out there. The Steele dossier is a great example, which was completely spurious, based on no actual evidence, but the intelligence agencies intentionally leaked it because they knew the media would go wild with it, and it would help this campaign that they were creating. The Iraq WMD scare is another great example of that. You can go once again down the list, back to the Gulf of Tonkin, back to the Spanish-American War, where the Hearst Corporation intentionally published fake information, yellow journalism, to justify the war so the US could take these colonies from Spain and make them their own colonies. It's not new, but what is new in some ways, although not entirely, is that in the digital age, alternative media, I think, in some ways has more influence than it could have had in the past. Although, you know, I don't want to engage in rosy retrospection and pretend like everything is so much better now, because you still had the greats like Ramparts magazine. You still had a very large local media and underground newspaper scene. So in some ways, corporate media consolidation has also, you know, flooded into alternative media as well in the 21st century. But the point is, once again, that the goal of corporate media is to manufacture consent for these policies that the intelligence agencies and the 1% that Wall Street want to carry out in the world.
Well, Ben, we have a great respect for Gray Zone as well, particularly when you publish articles like this. And I'll just leave by pointing out something that sent a chill down my back when Donald Trump stood up at his last State of the Union address and said, "America will never be a socialist country." And I think that that's driving a lot of this too, maybe the Latin American policy. They're worried about socialism coming in the US. So they're certainly not going to allow it. And it goes back to the Cold War too, the same thing of a Red Scare. But I think they're worried a little bit. For him to make a statement like that, I thought that was the ugliest moment of all the ugly moments of Trump's presidency for me. That was just extraordinary the way he said it too. So I think there's a new war on socialism in the US and certainly in Latin America. And we've seen an ugly chapter of that in Bolivia. And you guys did a great job chronicling exactly how that happened and telling us today even more detail. So we really thank you for coming on, Ben.
Yeah, well, the last thing I'll say is that not only a war on socialism. You know, it's part of this larger new Cold War on Russia and China, but also specifically in Latin America. I think we need to talk about the fact that there's a new Operation Condor. Operation Condor is not very well known, even among, you know, anti-war activists and journalists in the US, but this was an operation throughout the Cold War, specifically in the 70s and 80s, where largely the right-wing dictatorships in the Southern Cone, but other parts of Latin America, were working with US intelligence agencies to viciously, violently crush the communist and socialist movement throughout Latin America. And I think what we're seeing now is an Operation Condor 2.0. And I would not be surprised, just as nowadays, thanks to the National Security Archive and some of these other groups, we have declassified documents showing Henry Kissinger meeting with these right-wing Latin American dictators and talking about how they can work together to destroy the evil communists. I would not be surprised in several years if we have new documents showing the same thing happening now, where not just the Trump administration, but the Obama administration and these other administrations, their officials in intelligence agencies and other forces are actively collaborating throughout Latin America to crush the pink tide, because that's ultimately what they fear above all. The pink tide and the potential for a unified Latin America that can ignore North America, that can economically integrate the South together between different countries, and can have independence for the first time in 200 years since the Monroe Doctrine was declared. And of course, the Trump administration, 3 officials in the Trump administration, top officials, have been repeatedly invoking the Monroe Doctrine when they talk about Latin America. They treat Latin America as their own backyard, and they're trying to do everything they can to return this region of the world that temporarily for about 20 years got free, to return them, to relegate them back to the status of being the U.S. backyard.
Well, Ben, thank you very much again for coming on CN Live, and hope to have you back again, probably to talk about something depressing that time too,
Yeah.
but really enlightening. So we appreciate you taking time out for us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much for the work you all do. Consortium News is one of the best outlets out there. For all the listeners and viewers, is you should donate to their work, because
I appreciate that. Okay.
We didn't ask you to say that.
I swear they didn't. But like, they and the Gray Zone are not to, you know, there are some other good media outlets still and alternative media, but you all and us are some of the only people still doing investigative journalism, original investigative reporting. So I'm grateful to you all and to the legacy. I mean, Joe, you do amazing work as well, but, you know, to the legacy, RIP of the greats at Consortium News.
Well, that's terrific to hear, Ben. Thank you again.
Bye.
Well, Elizabeth, that is the conclusion of a very interesting program. We want to thank Scott Ritter, Lee Stranahan, Pepe Escobar, Ben Norton, and our executive producer, Kathy Vogan, for her video report on Jen Robinson and Quentin Dempster. And of course, we thank our audience for your loyal following and continued support. This show marks the end of the first season of CN Live, in which we have delved deeply into some of the most pressing issues of our day, from press freedom to climate change and global and domestic politics. It's been an exhilarating ride, Elizabeth, and we'll be back in the new year with a whole new season of CN Live.
Good night, everyone, and thank you again for your support, and we look forward to seeing you again in the new year.